And welcome to another Architectural Democracy podcast. Here we are in Kaisa at Helsinki, Open Waves in Helsinki. Today is the 28th of May, 2025. And as usual, we have Mark Linder as the co host
Hello.
and a guest, Perry Walker. Hi, Perry.
Hello. Hello.
Perry, you and I have known each other for more than a decade. We met in the back of the energy days in the UK. I maybe this is not fair, but I always describe you as a person who found a calling in developing large scale engagement methods uh, and refining and developing them. Maybe that's oversimplified. How do you define yourself and what give us a sense of your formative experiences?
Oh, I just simply divide what you said into two stages. So all large-scale processes start small scale, and then that is the bit that I'm best at. And then the challenge, which I think we'll be coming on to, is how to turn small scale into large scale. And that's a different challenge.
Well, just take us back a little bit to your original motivations. I mean, you've done different things, I imagine. At one point, I think you worked for the Treasury. What inspired you to get involved with this in the first place?
I was working for, no, I'm not going back far enough. When I left university, I went and taught in Malawi, and all the teachers had to take the morning assembly. Most of the teachers gave up homily. And I remember doing two. And one was that we took C.S. Lewis' vision of heaven and hell. And C.S. Lewis said, in both places, people have 3-foot spoons attached to their arms. And in hell, everybody tries to feed themselves. Because they've got 3-foot spoons attached to their arms, it's a bit difficult. Whereas in heaven, everybody feeds each other. And we acted that out. And also, I said that life was like, I said that there were two sorts of textbooks for mathematics, which I was teaching. One was the teacher's version, which had the answers in the back. And the other was the student's version, which had no answers in the back. And I said, you may be told that there is a book with answers in the back, but life is not like that. It doesn't have the answers in the back of the book. And so I was certainly drawn to get away from the usual style of homily. And then years later, after I'd worked in the Treasury, I was working for John Lewis, which is a retailer in the UK, owned by the people who work there. And they own supermarkets for Waitrose. And those supermarkets, they have HR people. And I got involved in reorganizing the HR department. And I discovered that I really liked working with groups of people. And after that, I discovered there was such a thing called facilitation. I had no idea. I discovered you could get a job doing it. That's what I did. And then I sort of started to feel that there were things missing. I found myself staring into a black space. And this was a process that didn't exist and I felt should exist. And so that was what got me going into what I'm good at, possibly the only thing, which is innovating participatory processes.
How did you find out that it was a void?
That's a mysterious process. I somehow looked at it for 6 months and all I could see was a gap.
Hmm.
So in other words, you could fill that gap within the context of a meeting, but are you thinking like what happens outside the meeting? What happens in society? Is that the
This is an indirect answer to your question. So for some reason, I've not been interested in the most common form of participation in the world today, which are citizens' assemblies. For some reason, and I think I have to blame Jürgen Habermas, the German political thinker, I've always been interested in ways of talking that had the potential for everybody to participate. And so I've always looked for approaches that potentially could reach widely into society. And I've always, if I may give an example, which relates to one of your questions. About 20 years ago, I was living in southwest London in the UK, and I was living near a big park called Richmond Park. If you fly into Heathrow, you will fly over Richmond Park. And the Parks Authority had a proposal to ban cars from the park. There was nowhere to have a civilized discussion about whether that was a good idea or not. So all the discussion flowed through the correspondence columns of the local paper, the Richmond and Twickenham Times. And you could just see people getting further and further apart. People got sort of sarcastic. They started talking about all these lycra-clad grannies causing danger to car owners, etc., etc. It was so frustrating. It was so obvious that there was a need for a place for civilized discussion, and nobody else seemed to see that need.
That's fascinating.
Well, it's fascinating. I mean, another time we'll talk about what your thoughts are about the unstructured nature of social media and polarization. But to talk a little bit about your influences around the idea that there were engagement methods that were not win-lose, but win-win, because what you're describing as a dialectic through the lens of the paper is a sort of win-lose mentality, right? But
Sure.
you saw it differently. How did you get to that?
Well, the expression win-win comes from a woman called Mary Parker Follett. She's American. She should have gone to Harvard, but she wasn't allowed to because she was a woman. And she, perhaps because she wasn't part of the establishment, she was a radical thinker. As I say, she coined the expression win-win. And she tells a few stories about that, which I've always carried around in my head. So one of them is about two sisters who both want the same orange, and the compromise solution would be to cut the orange in half. But actually, when they went deeper into the needs of each of the two, one sister wanted the juice to drink and the other wanted the skin to put in the cake. And so it was possible to satisfy the needs of both with the one resource. And then years later, I came across a description of the Camp David negotiations between Egypt and Israel over the Sinai. And it turns out to follow exactly the same pattern. You've got this one resource, the Sinai, but actually it could satisfy the needs of both parties because they were so different. One wanted security, and I've forgotten the needs of the other. But the Sinai was, I think, given to Egypt, but demilitarized, and in such a way fulfilled the needs of both. And so I've been able to take the ideas of Mary Parker Follett and extend them into the world.
So some of this is I wouldn't say productized, but you have sort of methods to which you've given a name. What can you talk about that, and just sort of then come back to the sort of the intrinsic design then in the methods, and then we can talk about some applications and cases. But yeah,
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll talk about two. I'll talk about two. So the first one, which was the result of staring into the void, was called Demox. And all I did really was take the way that facilitators are addicted to Post-it notes. And rather than get people to write on blank Post-it notes, we effectively supplied the Post-its ready-made. So they had information about a complex topic that people wouldn't normally know. But the process was similar to what people do with Post-it notes. You take these cards and you arrange them so that each group of cards makes sense, and then you name that group so that you fix the meaning in your mind, and then you draw your conclusions. And you can find those cards under a different name on the website of Excite, which is the European Association of Science Centres, ECSITE, under a different name, under a name of Played Aside. And you'll find there, I think, at least 20 different topics, 20 different languages, been used by thousands of people across Europe. I can't really take the credit for that, but that's the truth of it. The second method I wanted to talk about was this indeed does have a name. It's called the win-win workout. I believe there's another www out there somewhere, but perhaps that's not so important. And the win-win workout it's really interesting. I used to have a postcard that showed somebody saying, I've learned so much from my mistakes, I think I'll make another one. And in the case of the win-win workout, I think that's my colleague Paul Thistlethwaite and I, had an instinct there was something there, but it took a lot of mistakes to get there. And we've held about 60 events over about 5 years on about 25 topics in order to make enough mistakes to evolve the process.
And so win-win workout is, can you sort of encapsulate what it is? I mean, is it as a sort of fixed period of time? Is it, yeah.
It's pretty short. They basically last a couple of hours. So in a way, I mean, of course, there's a limit to what you can do in 2 hours. It is in a sense a taster. So first of all, it often uses role play, which is one way of, I think, diffusing the arguments that normally take place in political gatherings. So we recently did an event with Sheffield Museums, and the woman from the museum told me that the role play had diffused the people who came along with their fixed point of view, which they wanted to express. They were invited, perhaps pushed, to take on a different role, and so that both distracted them from the argument they wanted to make, and I hope gave them, as a result, more empathy with somebody with a point of view different from their own. So that's the first element, role play. Secondly, people foregather with other people who take on that same role, because it's not easy. You start by bringing your own attitudes to that role, and so it takes time to absorb it. And then you get into a mixed group, where there are people with attitudes different from your own, roles different from your own. So last Monday, there was an event in a school in the south of England, and they were discussing prisons. And so the three characters, the three roles were Priti Patel, used to be the UK Home Secretary. She wants tougher prisons. Rory Stewart, another British cabinet minister, former cabinet minister, he wants better prisons. And Angela Davis, the American radical, who wants no prisons, who wants them abolished. So you've got those different roles, and people take on those roles in mixed groups. Then their challenge is to come up with a statement on prisons that all three of them can agree with. So that's where they're pushed to find common ground. And it's a bit of a game. And it's a challenge as well, not easy. And it was very interesting that one of the groups of students at this school in the south of England, their statement was actually nothing to do with prisons at all. It was all about how to improve the education system so that more students were aware of consequences of crime, the consequences of getting a criminal record, and the benefits of avoiding it. So then, this is where the sort of gamified bit comes in, all the statements from lots of different mixed groups are put together, and everybody takes part in voting on them. They say, from my point of view of my character, is this particular statement acceptable to me? Acceptable. So we're using the principle of consensus, that what matters is acceptability, whether somebody can live with something. And then we can find out which of those statements is most acceptable to most people. And so there's a winner.
By effectively sort of forcing people to adopt a different identity and then internalize the issues through that identity, sort of vicariously, they then presumably develop an understanding of the possibility of other points of view. And then you can follow that process all the way through At what
Mhm.
point do they then, or do they revert to their original point of view and then evaluate the result of all of this? So in other words, I've had to play Pretty Patel,
Mm.
which is, let's just say let's just say for the sake of argument, it's a role I play in the group, but I'm not personally comfortable with that role. Do I ever revert back to Mark Linder and then look at everything back original form?
That's a design choice. So when we did the event with Sheffield Museums that I was describing, um, we went through this process, but that was the basis on which there was then a discussion between the participants and museum staff as to what, in particular, Sheffield Museums should do on this issue. Topic was whether, when, and how should museums return objects. So at that stage, people became themselves because that was what the museum wanted. But that was a design choice. So maybe yes, maybe no.
And so what are the challenges in scaling a method like this?
Yeah.
Like how could you take something like this and yeah, make it really
Sure.
big?
So if you take the example of the school, so it turned out that the internet connection was poor, and so I was here in Berlin, they were in Kent in England, and so in fact the school teacher pretty much ran it all, didn't need me at all. He just went by the instructions. Another example is that a couple of months ago, I did a couple of sessions at a university here in Germany on whether Germany should reintroduce conscription. It's quite a topic here. And I went along to run this with a friend who teaches there. And so we did a couple of sessions together. It then turned out that one of her colleagues thought this is a nice idea and done it the day before. And another colleague had done it the day after, nothing to do with me. So it's clear there is potential for people to run it for themselves. And I have not this project, but in earlier projects, developed material that people have just downloaded and done around the kitchen table. So you could potentially have people in their homes, people in their workplaces, people wherever, running events. And then you can connect those by using a website like Polis, which I can come on to collect all the results from all these different events and have anybody who took part express their view on those results from wherever they came.
So for example, if one were to extrapolate your German conscription issue and consider the question of European conscription, this theoretically could be done in all countries across Europe locally and then aggregated using a service like Polis to effectively consider a question which has a tremendous amount of complexity to it. Yeah, so it's very interesting. And to talk a little
How
bit,
would that work
yeah,
in a European level?
So supposing supposing the topic is conscription at European level, and people can download a kit. It has to be fairly straightforward, but it can contain the essential information about the topic. They have a discussion in the way that I've described. And then I'd like to say a little bit more about how Polis and similar platforms work. So Polis, the website is just pol.is, allows people to upload statements that they've made about conscription as a result of their meeting, and then for other people to vote on them. All they can do is they say, I agree or I disagree. And then I think this is the clever thing about Polis. It says, we've taken the results from 10,000 people, say, and they seem to fall into, say, 3 different attitude groups. And it then invites people to look for statements that are agreed across those different attitude groups. So if I can give an example, this is very much used in a process called V-Taiwan. So your listeners may know that there was a Velvet Revolution in Taiwan, as a result of which a woman called Audrey Tang, who'd been a hacker, became Minister of Digital Communications, and she used Polis a great deal. One time it was used was when Uber wanted to come into Taiwan, and there were massive protests by taxi drivers. Now, it was clear what the two camps were, Uber and the taxi drivers, but they did look for statements that commanded agreement across those two groups. And the first one was, taxis don't need to be yellow. Completely trivial, but it showed that there was agreement possible in a situation where probably most people thought there was nothing that could be agreed, that could be found. After that, they started to find statements that were more meaningful, that were also agreed, such as Uber should be allowed to enter Taiwan, provided it could show that it wouldn't damage the existing taxi trade. So what then happened was they found 5 or 6 statements like that both camps agreed on. They held some deliberative workshops, which could have been done using the win-win process I described. They could have. And the results of those workshops were turned into the regulations that the Taiwanese government applied to Uber. I'm not quite sure this is right, but I have read that the whole process took 5 weeks, which compared to the democratic process in Western European countries is a miracle.
Yeah, that sounds. But so the people are not voting, right? They are stating opinions.
Well, depends what you mean by voting, but they are saying, I've read all the statements. Go on.
Sorry, no, I mean they're not at the end. They will vote for tendencies, like in the like they will not make a final decision ever. They will make a series of steps, and that's where the decision is, like their tendency, their decision answering questions, or so there's not going to be a moment where people have to say yes or no to a final decision.
In other words, there's no referendum that comes at the end of this, so to speak.
No, in this case there wasn't. So it could have been, but there wasn't. So, and that's a difficult one. So you may know that one of the very early citizens' assemblies was held in British Columbia about voting reform in the year 2000, I think. And there was the assembly came to a very clear conclusion about the way in which reform should take place. But the British Columbia government had committed to a referendum. So there was a referendum, and I really think because the lay people had not been through that process, the assembly members had been through, the proposal for reform was voted down. So I understand why you asked the question. Of course, there's a strong case for giving people the ultimate decision. But in that particular case, I would have been happy to rely on the results of the assembly.
Yeah, because I mean the process of voting, and you yourself also been critical about informed. I mean, there is even I think it was Isaac Asimov that was made this famous article about the culture, the culture of ignorance, something like that, where one vote, one person, one vote. It's a very bad start for a working democracy because people are differently informed, differently affected, and we are just trying to make a system where it's on the lowest denominator. So your methods are trying to avoid that.
That's a tricky one. So in terms of citizens' assemblies, just to stick with them for a second, you will know, and your listeners will know, about the particular case, the famous case about abortion in Ireland, where the citizens' assembly process unlocked a stalemate among politicians. And in that case, it was indeed followed by a referendum, and it was passed. And so it's certainly possible to use the assembly to educate the voters so that the voting is more informed. I'm not sure I've answered your question properly. Perhaps you can ask it again.
No, just wondering because the voting is it's always going to be. I mean, that gap between who decides. I mean, we went for democracy as one person, meaning one vote, because probably the complexity of attributing different weights to the vote. Like if I'm more affected by this bridge that is on my face, like I live nearby, I should have a bigger vote. Or I'm an engineer, I should have my vote should be maybe 1.2, not one. And a person living far away should maybe vote should not be one, but 0.8. But who defines that? Or how is the complexity on that? Are we dealing with, is this a problem of complexity or is it a problem of something else? That's why I was intrigued by your method to try if it the goal could be to avoid that in another way, in terms of not increasing complexity to overload people, but still making decisions, better ones. That's what I was aiming at. I don't know.
Hmm. I mean, I think there are some methods that do try and get around the problems you describe. So I find nothing to do with me really, but I find the notion of liquid democracy very interesting.
Mm,
That I'm not as well informed on an urban planning issue as you are, Pedro. So I give you my vote, and you think, well, actually, I'm away on holiday at the time, so of votes, I'm going to give my vote to Mark, and with that comes my vote as well. And then I discover that you, Pedro, have voted on something else in a way I didn't like, so I withdraw my vote from you. So there's a way of starting to tackle the issue that you describe. I'm we're doing an issue. Sorry, we're doing an event on local housing, so rural planning rather than urban planning. And what happens at the moment is that it's the people who live in the village who are, excuse me, who are involved. The people who might live in the village, depending on whether a particular development goes ahead or not, they are not involved. So, of course, what you describe is a really important issue. And I don't have a particularly good answer, but I think there are cases when, for example, rather than use sortition to generate a citizens' assembly and its members, it would be more appropriate to think about the stakeholders. There's another aspect of this, which is a very important part of the win-win workout, is separating out the position, the solution, the what, as you might say, from what's underneath that, the why. What is it that people value? What are their needs, and so on. Now, in order to identify a good solution, you usually need expertise. You need the urban planners to come in. But if you simply want people to say, this is what matters to me, you don't need the experts at all. And so it's entirely legitimate for the people to say, by whatever means, this is what matters to us. Now we want you, the experts, to tell us how we might achieve those aims, and we will work together to make sure that that link between what we want and the solution is the best one. So it's hard to scale, but this process of generating consensus does give you the possibility of achieving good result without the problems of voting that you've described.
You see, just to applying it to the urban realm, I mean, a typical case in a catchment area, you have legacy residents who have a sense of their own sense of the heritage and the value drivers. And then you have, with a development happening, you have effectively new people who are coming in with different priorities. They might have a catchment area that's sort of gentrified or elderly, let's say, to make it more demographic, and the new people coming in are families with children. They need different services, etc. And the two sides have different sets of priorities. And so, on one hand, what you're describing has the value of all parties feeling like they have been heard, which changes in effect their ability to relate to the outcome and support it. But by the same token, you do have intrinsic differences and value differences in values, and so the process of actually working out what is effectively, you need the skin, I need the juice. Doesn't that take Does that take expertise to figure that out? In other words, you sort of meld together all these interests, but then somebody who's sort of removed from the process has to say, aha, okay, here is the way to sort of split this cake. Or do those ideas
Hmm.
actually emerge from this process? In other words, if you have enough of a process, are you going to have the idea of, wait a minute, let's separate the orange from the juice? That's an answer. Or does somebody outside the process need to see, wait a minute, we have to separate the orange from the juice? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah. So I think it depends on the issue. I think in the case of the orange, the two sisters could probably work it out for themselves
Yeah,
without getting an external consultant.
yeah.
Um, and I think in the case of the Sinai, um, because the process was well handled, it must have become evident to everybody, A, that Egypt's needs and Israel's needs were different, and B, that they could both be satisfied in the Sinai. Um, what else did I want to say?
I mean, so in other words, the innovation that's necessary to create a win-win
Hmm.
can come from the process itself. In other words,
In some, yes, you
yeah.
can.
But has it been trialed in terms of, did you make the same attempt from like a bit of a piloting group? Like, have you done this comparison like with the win-win or uh, or the usual thing, just post-its?
Ah, yes, so towards the end of last year, late 2024, we ran a couple of events with local authorities in the UK, one in Worthing, which is on the south coast, and one in York, which is a city in the north. And I think in both cases, first of all, a lot of public meetings are pretty unpleasant. Um, I heard about one a long time ago where the chair said things got so bad he was afraid he was about to witness ethnic cleansing. In this particular case, because we provided a structure, we weren't using role play, but we provided a lot of structure, there were no arguments. And so that was the first relief for the council. Secondly, they got useful results because we identified what the potential aims of this 20 miles an hour scheme were, and we got people to discuss those aims. So we pushed them down to the why. We didn't start up here at all. We started here. We started with the why, and we got people to prioritise those aims. So the council ended up with a very clear sense of what mattered to people and what the ranking was. And there may have been one or two people who were a bit disappointed because they were expecting a vigorous debate and an argument, but the design prevented that.
You think so? Okay, to sort of to turn this to sort of larger scale planning issues. I mean,
Hmm.
for an example that comes to mind is Britain for generations has complained about not having enough housing.
Hmm.
Every administration promises it, it doesn't
Hmm.
deliver. The current administration has made very ambitious goals, etc. And certainly one thing that comes into play in all of this is basic good old-fashioned NIMBYism. And
Sure.
so you sort of think that as societies get bigger and more complex, there is more NIMBYism because there's more to be protected. When you look at situations like that, do you see a role for this kind of engagement to address that kind of systemic issue? Which I mean, it's NIMBYism plagues large-scale development of all kinds of infrastructure, rail, and well, Britain is a good example of all of this, and rail, housing, you
Hmm.
name it, right? But
Sure.
every developed country has it. It's not an autocracy, right? Autocracies don't quite have the same problem. Do you think these techniques are, when you see these sort of conundrums, what comes to mind from your point of view, your design skills? What do you wish were going on that's you don't see enough of?
Sure. Two things. So the first is that you would have say a meta level citizens' assembly. So you're bringing to bear on the issue people who have no stake in the development, because this is being discussed at the national level. And the job of the assembly would be to say, what's the trade-offs between housing and the alternative uses of the land and so on. Secondly, when you get down to the level of individual cities, villages, towns, a good process develops, as we've said, empathy. And it develops what somebody called Mickey Cashton would call the willingness to stretch. So there was a discussion somewhere in America about what should happen to a particular place. There were two communities involved, one a wealthy one on one side of the tracks, one poor one on the other side of the tracks, and they had a constructive discussion, a constructive process of discussions, at the end of which the rich community said, well, our needs are not as great as the needs of the community on the other side of the tracks. We think all the resources should go there. So this process of creating empathy does, if it goes well, reduce the conflict, the NIMBYism that you're talking about.
I think that's a fundamental output that doesn't. It's maybe more valuable because when listening to you, you think, of course, the output is some sort of reconciliation or resolution or consolidation of opinions and a certain amount of innovation to how to solve the problem. But you're saying that actually the act of engaging in the process is in effect long run maybe more interesting and valuable because first of all you create the latitude of acceptance, you expand that for what is possible, and you change the dynamic of the relationships, which presumably changes the social cohesion and other things that have a longer term effect. Do you think this is sort of underrepresented in the way the sort of your kind of participative techniques are discussed? I mean, yeah.
Yes, it is, because I'm somebody who thinks more about process than content. I'm not terribly interested in my own views on the issues of the day. I have them, but I don't feel a need to share them. But that's very rare. Most people are much less interested in process and much more interested in content. One of the reasons I'm glad to be here is that I feel among friends in that respect.
So as you look at like some of the issues of the day, do you have an urge to see more application like this? You've got big chunks of the world that need rebuilding. You've got all the issues we mentioned in developed societies. And now this is, of course, what I'm saying comes at it from a urban planning point of view, but you certainly see the same issues in terms of climate change, the same issues in terms of the impending onslaught of AI, which is sort of like, in 5 years, it'll be like dealing with a new species on the planet, right? So there's a tremendous amount of decision making that has to go on. Is this then, in your view, opening up the need for this kind of process where
Yes, for
cooperation
sure.
is needed? I mean, not to interrupt you, but I mean, you take the relationship with China, where the Americans are unified on both sides of the political spectrum that China should be declared the enemy, and there is no hope of cooperation. You cannot say a good word about cooperation with China in the States right now, to overgeneralize. But that doesn't sound like a good idea coming from your perspective. Um, Go ahead.
I pause because, of course, I agree with you about the need, and most of the processes that I've been involved in myself and observe other people using are issue blind. They don't particularly depend on what the issue is. And so those ones that you raised, China, artificial intelligence and so on, there's no reason why these processes shouldn't apply. But the question is, as you raise, how do you get them in there when, to quote your example, anybody in America will hear a word about the possibility of cooperating with China. Now, I don't have a particularly good answer to that, but I do think that in crises, people look for what tools and what evidence is lying around. And so I think there is value in having lying around examples of where, even if it's done on a role play basis, people have explored what cooperation between the two countries would look like.
So in the win-win, can it also be rephrased as consensus building?
Yes, it's a form of consensus building. Yes.
Would it, and for that you say that empathy would play a big role in the process, like, and can we imagine, for example, a world, you're picking up on the AI topic, where, for example, imagine I could have a chat one-to-one with Ursula von der Leyen and talk about why did you do that? An AI generated Ursula picking up a real Ursula, and she can talk one-to-one, explaining or talking about why. Do you imagine a world that this could be possible or even beneficial? Because then Ursula would that probably increase the gap? Probably would no. I mean, I never thought about this, but that's why I'm tossing it to you now.
Your imagination stretches beyond mine. So why not? But of course, what I'm interested in is then all the people who've had one-to-one conversations with Ursula themselves have a conversation about their reaction to that. And that's what goes back to her.
And she herself would not have that conversation.
But we don't, just
Right.
to weigh in here, and not to channel you, Perry, but I can't imagine you agreeing with that because the coming to alignment with a bot is not the same thing as coming to alignment with a human. Even coming to disalignment with a human, I would think is better than coming to alignment with a bot, right? And so you could have, but to take Pedro's point, you're probably going to have the illusion of large scale interactivity like that with AI, right? So all of Europe's going to participate in these discussions and have a chance to interact with the top guys using AI, right? And that'll be a sort of palliative for building emotional empathy, but it's not the same thing. It's like, and I don't think it's what humans want. I mean, why, uh, the 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 bots, the AI plays a better game of chess than humans, but we don't like to watch computers playing chess. We watch humans playing chess, even though they screw up and all that stuff, right? So what do you think about that? Do you think that there's a limitation to the role of AI in this role of engagement?
I'm going to take the guest privilege of answering a question different from the one you've just asked. So I do think there are implications in what you've both been saying for the nature of a parliament. Presumably we have parliaments because we couldn't get everybody into the room.
Hmm.
And the question does arise, does the use of AI, accepting the limitations you describe, Mark, potentially allow us to get everybody's voice into the room? And of course, there comes a point at which this has to be about humans, and you have to check that this is the real Perry Walker and not this bot I've sent along to replace me.
Yes, yes.
But I do think that the question then arises, to which I don't have an answer, as to whether we can reinvent parliaments, do away with them, etc., etc.
I think there's no a way around it. It will have to be reinvented.
I agree.
I mean, the latest case of this participatory process of the Eurovision Song Contest, where Israel got the biggest public voting, which is now being contested by Spain, Belgium, and other countries. Like, it seems very absurd that this was true, that Spanish callers voted for Israel, or all of it. I mean, even Portugal, like, it was an absurd. Very likely it was interfered. that it was either a scheme that from Israel or somebody interfered in some way. And that's where probably also Mark is talking about, like, our ability then to this, I mean, to trust. Uh, we already have a problem trusting humans, but we have something called intuition, is the aggregation of all senses into discerning the reality. But in terms of intuition against or towards AI, it's going to be tough, or likely impossible.
Well, perhaps we will have to stick with parliaments because we'll have to be able to see that there are, whatever it is, 300, 600 humans in the chamber.
What I think is so interesting about your process, Perry, is the humanity of it, in the sense that,
Hmm.
particularly the adoption of roles, it forces something which is a very human challenge. How can you get yourself into somebody else's shoes and sort of see the world the way that person sees the world? And does that exercise help you see the world from your point of view, right?
Hmm.
And the sheer pain of that is what makes it useful. And to some extent, you say, well, that's going to limit the scalability for sure. But that's also the value. I mean,
Hmm.
if I submit something, which you can do with today's AI, I can take something that I've written or whatever and say, what would Jacques Lacan think about the psychology of this? That's not the same as getting actual opinion from Jacques Lacan, and it's, not the same risk involved in
Hmm.
bearing your ideas in front of someone like him. So, but that's the part that makes it worthwhile. And
Hmm.
so I think intrinsic in your argument is to sort of, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but in some sense to protect the sanctity of the human voice in this thing, which
Mm.
is to say, you want to resolve a tough planning issue? Yes, there has to be an investment in people actually getting together, sometimes in an actual room, not just online, confronting these things, writing these cards from different roles, stepping back, looking at all this mess, because that's the only way they're going to actually understand each other and build that empathy, which is, in a way, the bit of business of the decision is a bit of a head feint. The real thing is to walk out of there. Well, we didn't come to the agreement I believed in, but I sure like these people a lot better. That's really what you want, right?
Yes, it is. And I agree that there is a worry that people will think, well, we've used AI to analyze all social media and these are the conclusions. So there isn't, as you say, an essential human part of this process of coming together and so on. But I think it has to do with the fact that so much of social media and so on happens at the top level, the level of the what should be done about something, i.e. the what, and what social media does not reveal is the why. And it's for that reason, I think, that we can never take humans out of the process.
Well, you made a strong argument for process, in a way, over content,
Hmm.
which is, I think, is quite valuable. So,
Mm.
what's the what's the biggest
This
sort of,
festival thing I would like to ask before we run out
yeah,
of time. What was it? Pan European, yeah, the Pan European Festival of Democracy. What is this about?
Hmm. Well, I mean, as your questions imply, like you, I think about how is it possible to scale these things. And I was so pleased, Mark, that you reminded me about the democracy festivals of the Nordic Baltic region, which I'd forgotten about. And I think they are a really good model. And I think they could be extended by the sort of by the use of the win-win workout as we've been discussing, in the sense that you could have people starting off with small groups of 3 or 6 at home and gradually building that up, connecting people and their results. And so developing a sense of, for example, what Europe as a whole thinks about conscription. So the democracy festivals in places like Sweden and Finland, rely on people coming together in quite a confined space over a week. But I think you can create the same sense of fellow feeling, um, building up from these very, very small events, but in a different way.
Has it started, or is this a plan, or?
It's a dream.
Let's, keep us involved, because this sounds
I shall
exciting.
do. I certainly shall.
But this also, we were just discussing this with Mark, like what, I mean, Europe is a bit now being, it's a bit difficult to define what Europe is now. Like EU, Europe, geographically, culturally, political, it's European Union, and this, is this a good sign? I mean, that you cannot define. Is this a good sign of democracy?
I don't know about that. I mean, when you really scroll back, you ask yourself, is there really a Europe, right?
Mm.
So not to,
Well, there is something,
it's not
right?
a cynical question, but I mean, there's no head of state for Europe. There's no centralization of accepted federal power, if you will. That's a result of a democratic process, and so this is in you know in inhibition, if you will. So that, but to take it from Perry's point of view, the fact that there isn't a sort of material Europe in the sense that there's a material United States in the same way, doesn't mean you can't have consciousness of Europe more firmly in mind, which is where Pedro's coming from.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about the Festival of Democracy, I guess implicitly that has a we can be defined as having a European context
Mm.
and not sort of reliant on the EU or any of the specific institutions. It's simply a regard for a sort of coalition of the states in Europe that actually want to cooperate on the big issues of the day.
Coalition of people.
Coalition of people. Yeah.
I mean, as you, Perry, told many times, people want, I mean, there's a strong desire of being heard, the importance of being heard. Uh, and going back to your, like, why is this relevant? Is this identity, ownership? Is it the process? Because if being heard is just a vote, a click, or an AI, it is the process also. Then, therefore, yeah, it's not just being heard, but how you're being heard.
Hmm. If I may, this is somebody in Spain who had taken part in participatory budgeting. And she said, you can see the politicians this year, now, in the elections. If you see the electoral advertising, I smile to myself because I see things from the participatory budgeting really honest. It means they listened. They listened to what we were asking for. This is really a big thing for me. They listened. Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. So that's being listened in a very different way from casting your vote once every 5 years.
Well, listen, Perry, thank you very much. That's a optimistic note to end this.
Great.
That there is a possibility that European democracy can retain its, well, maybe it's going to wind up being the only functioning democracy on the planet. Who knows? But certainly now it's probably the way things are going is already the best operating model.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll be the last man standing. We'll have to see.
Yeah.
Agree.
Yeah. We really, I mean, of course, we would have a lot of topics to continue. I mean, it's just warming up. Really nice. Really nice. I really enjoyed this. But again, if the topic would be too simple, it would have been solved way back. And people like you are always an inspiration to talk with. to see the work done and the dreams ahead, and see that not giving up is not an option. Um, so thank you so much for the talk, and hope that we engage again soon.
Me too.
Thank you,
Thank you very
Perry.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you.